My neighbor moved out overnight. No moving truck, no goodbye, just an empty house. But every night, at exactly 9 o'clock, every light in that house turns on, and someone always closes the curtains before I can see inside. I used to think I understood my own street. I was wrong. Hi everyone, my name is Daniel, and today I'm going to tell you about the strangest year of my life. It started with an empty house next door. It ended with a truth I never expected, a truth that changed the way I think about the people around me forever. This is a long story, so stay with me, because every part of it matters. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon. Small houses, big trees, the kind of street where everyone waves but nobody really knows each other's business. I liked it that way. I worked long hours as a software developer, and when I came home I wanted peace and quiet, not conversation. My neighbor was a woman named Mrs. Watfold. She was in her 60s, lived alone, and kept mostly to herself. We spoke maybe 5 times a year. A wave here, a comment about the weather there. Nothing more. She had a small garden with tomatoes and roses, and every summer she would leave a basket of vegetables on my porch without ever knocking or saying a word. I always found it a little strange, but also kind. That was who I thought she was. A quiet, gentle old woman with a green thumb and not much else going on in her life. Looking back now, I realize how little I actually knew about the woman living 20 feet from my kitchen window. Then one Tuesday in October, I came home from work and noticed something different. Her car was gone, the porch light was off, and a small for sale sign was leaning against her mailbox, like someone had put it there in a hurry and forgot to push it into the ground properly. I didn't think much of it at first. People move, people sell houses. It's normal, especially for someone her age. Maybe she was moving closer to family. Maybe she was downsizing. I told myself a dozen reasonable explanations as I carried my groceries inside. But something felt wrong, even if I couldn't say exactly what. There was no moving truck, no boxes on the curb, no neighbors gathered around saying goodbye the way they usually do when someone leaves after 15 years on the same street. In this neighborhood, when someone moves, there's always a small gathering. Coffee on the porch, old photographs shared, a few tears, maybe a hug. There was none of that here. She was just gone, as if she had evaporated overnight, leaving nothing behind but a house and a crooked sign. I told myself it wasn't my business. I went inside, made dinner, and tried to forget about it. I turned on the television, ate at my kitchen counter, and thought about work deadlines instead. For a couple of hours, it worked. I almost forgot about the empty house next door entirely. Then came 9 o'clock. I looked out my kitchen window out of habit, the way you glance somewhere 1,000 times without thinking, and every light in Mrs. Watfold's house turned on at once. Every single one. The living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms, even the small window in the attic that I had never once seen lit in the 3 years I had lived next door. I stood there, frozen, a dish towel still in my hand, staring across the yard at a house that was supposed to be empty. My first thought was that maybe she hadn't actually moved. Maybe the sale had fallen through and she was still living there, and I had simply misunderstood the situation. But her car still wasn't in the driveway. There was no sound of a television, no music, no dog barking, nothing that would suggest an actual person going about an actual evening. I watched for almost 10 minutes, standing perfectly still at my own window like some kind of amateur detective. Nothing moved, no shadows crossed the windows, no sound came from the house. Just light, pouring out into the dark, like the house itself was breathing on its own, independent of anyone living inside it. Then, just as suddenly as they had turned on, the lights went out, all of them, at the exact same moment, as if a single switch controlled the entire house. I told myself it was on a timer. Some people do that when they travel, to make a house look occupied so it doesn't get rubbered. That made sense. That was reasonable, simple, explainable. I repeated that explanation to myself until I half believed it, and I went to bed telling myself the mystery was already solved. Until the next night. At 9 o'clock exactly, the lights turned on again. Same pattern, same silence, same emptiness, and this time I saw something I couldn't explain away with a timer. A curtain moved. Just slightly in the upstairs window, the one that used to be Mrs. Watfold's bedroom. like someone had reached out and pulled it closed from the inside, quickly, as if trying to avoid being seen. My heart started pounding, a heavy, uncomfortable thud against my ribs. I told myself it was the wind, even though the night was completely still, the trees outside barely swaying. I told myself it was my imagination, even though I had seen it clearly, the fabric shifting, a hand pulling it shut. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the lights on again in the middle of the night, though they never came back on until the following evening. The next morning, I decided to ask around, mostly to reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I walked 2 houses down to talk to Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, an older couple who had lived on the street even longer than Mrs. Watfold, long enough to remember when half the houses on the block were still under construction. "Did Mrs. Watfold say anything to you before she left?" I asked, trying to sound casual, like I was just making friendly conversation over their fence. Mrs. Alvarez looked at me strangely, her eyebrows drawing together. "She didn't tell anyone she was leaving," she said. "One day she was here, watering her garden, same as always. The next day, gone, no goodbye, no forwarding address. It was strange, honestly, even for her." "Even for her?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Alvarez hesitated, glancing at her husband, who shrugged and went back to trimming his hedge, clearly not interested in gossip. "She was always private," Mrs. Alvarez said carefully, "kept to herself, never talked about her past. We used to joke that she must have been a spy or something, the way she never shared anything personal." "Do you know who's handling the sale of the house?" I asked. She shook her head. "There was a sign for maybe 2 days, and then it disappeared. No agent ever came to show it, no lockbox on the door, nothing. I actually thought about calling the number on the sign myself, out of curiosity, but by the time I looked again, the sign was already gone." That made even less sense. A house doesn't go up for sale and then just stop being for sale, disappearing along with the sign itself. Someone has to manage that, someone has to be responsible for it. I thanked her and walked home, my mind spinning with more questions than I had started with. I even mentioned it briefly to a coworker the next day, during a lunch break at the small cafe near my office. Half hopping, she would tell me I was overthinking a simple, ordinary situation. Her name was Priya, and she listened patiently as I described the lights, the timing, the curtain that seemed to move on its own. "Sounds like a timer and an overactive imagination," she said, laughing gently, though not unkindly. "Or maybe she's got a house sitter nobody bothered to introduce to the neighborhood." It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of ordinary explanation I wanted to believe. But something in me knew, even then, that a house sitter wouldn't explain the vanished for sale sign, or the complete absence of any car, any mail pickup, any of the small daily signs of an actual person quietly living their life. I nodded along with her theory anyway, not wanting to sound as unsettled as I actually felt, and went back to work telling myself I would simply stop paying attention to it. That resolution lasted exactly 1 evening. That evening I decided to pay closer attention. At 9 o'clock, right on schedule, the lights came on again, filling the windows with a soft yellow glow that somehow felt more unsettling in its predictability. This time, I grabbed my phone, telling myself I would take a photo if anything strange happened, and walked closer to the fence between our properties. I wanted to see, really see, what was happening inside, instead of guessing from a distance. Through the kitchen window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The kitchen table was set, 2 plates, 2 glasses, silverware arranged neatly beside each one, as if someone was expecting dinner guests any minute now. Though the house had been empty for over a week. No food, no steam rising from anything, just an empty, waiting table set for 2 people who clearly weren't coming. I backed away from the fence and went inside, locking my door behind me, even though I knew that was probably ridiculous. Whatever was happening next door wasn't going to come looking for me, probably. Still, I checked the lock twice before going to bed. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It followed me to work, distracting me during meetings, popping into my head during quiet moments at my desk. I started researching Mrs. Watfold online during my lunch breaks, trying to find any information about where she might have gone. I found almost nothing. No social media accounts. No new address listed anywhere I could find, not in any public records I had access to. It was like she had disappeared completely, like she had never existed outside of that house and that street. I even called the local real estate office, listed on similar signs in the neighborhood, describing the situation as casually as I could manage. "We don't have any listing for that address," the woman on the phone told me, sounding slightly confused. "Are you sure the sign said our company?" I wasn't sure, actually. I hadn't looked closely enough, too distracted by everything else about that strange evening. By the time I checked again, the sign was already gone from the yard entirely, just like Mrs. Alvarez had said it eventually would be. Something about this whole situation felt deliberately hidden, deliberately confusing. Like someone wanted the house to look abandoned, while also wanting no one to ask too many questions about it or look too closely at what was really happening. I decided to try something bolder, something that would either give me answers or embarrass me thoroughly enough to finally let this go. On a Friday evening, right before 9 o'clock, I walked to Mrs. Watfold's front door and knocked, my heart already beating faster than it should have for something so simple. No answer. I knocked again, harder, the sound echoing oddly in the quiet evening air. Still nothing. Then, right on schedule, I heard a click from somewhere deep inside the house, some kind of mechanism engaging, and the lights came on all at once, right as I was standing on the porch, closer to the source than I had ever been before. My heart nearly stopped. I stepped back from the door, staring at the windows glowing above me, glowing behind me, glowing all around the small porch where I stood. For a moment, I swore I saw a shape move past the living room window, visible just at the edge of the curtain. A shadow, tall and quick, gone before I could be sure I had really seen it, before I could convince myself it was more than my own frightened imagination playing tricks. I didn't wait around to find out. I walked home fast, almost running by the time I reached my own porch, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about that shadow, that shape moving behind the glass, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the window it passed by. Someone or something was in that house, and whoever it was clearly didn't want to be seen, didn't want to answer the door, didn't want any explanation for what was happening. The next day, exhausted and unable to concentrate on anything else, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of confronting the mystery directly, which had clearly gone nowhere useful, I started asking around the neighborhood more carefully, trying to piece together anything I could about Mrs. Watfold's life before she disappeared, hoping some older resident might remember something useful. An older man named Frank, who had lived on the street for almost 30 years, longer than anyone else I knew, told me something on his porch one afternoon that changed everything I thought I understood about my quiet neighbor. "She wasn't always Watfold," he said, sipping his coffee slowly, looking out at the street like he was seeing it decades earlier instead of today. "When she first moved in, back in the 90s, her name was different. Harmon, I think, Alana Harmon. She changed it a few years later after." He paused, like he was deciding whether to continue, whether this was really his story to tell. "After what?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, unable to hide my curiosity anymore. "After her husband disappeared," Frank said quietly, his voice dropping like he was still cautious about the subject even after all these years. "Big scandal at the time, made the local papers for weeks. He worked in finance, handled a lot of money for people in this area, wealthy clients, retirement funds, that sort of thing. One day he just vanished, along with a lot of money that wasn't his." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "What happened to him?" Frank shrugged, setting his coffee cup down carefully. "Nobody really knows, not for certain. Police looked for years, followed leads all over the place. Some people said he ran off to another country, changed his name, started a whole new life somewhere warm with the stolen money. Others said—" He hesitated again, glancing at me almost like he regretted starting this conversation. "Others said he never left town at all." That single sentence stuck with me for the rest of the day, echoing in my mind through every meeting, every task, every quiet moment at my desk. He never left town at all. Could it be possible that whatever or whoever was in that house at night had something to do with her husband's disappearance decades ago? Could old, buried secrets somehow be connected to lights turning on at 9 o'clock every night, to a dinner table set for two, to a shadow moving quickly past a window? I spent the next 2 days trying to find any information about a man named Harmon who had disappeared from this area, connected to a financial scandal, searching through every archive and database I could access with an ordinary internet connection and too much curiosity. Eventually, late one evening, I found an old newspaper archive online, a small local story from over 20 years earlier, buried deep in a search that took far longer than it should have. The headline read, "Local Financial Advisor Vanishes Amid Fraud Investigation." The article described a man named Richard Harmon, accused of stealing significant amounts of money from clients over several years, who disappeared without a trace just before he was set to be formally charged and arrested. His wife, Alana Harmon, was quoted briefly in the article, claiming she had no knowledge of his crimes and no idea where he had gone, that she was as shocked and confused as everyone else in their small community. The case was never solved, according to a brief follow-up article a year later. Richard Harmon was never found, never located, never brought to any kind of justice or resolution. I sat back in my chair that night, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of everything, all these disconnected pieces suddenly forming a shape I hadn't expected. If Alana Harmon had become Mrs. Watfold, if she had lived quietly on this street for years, hiding from a past that had never been fully explained or resolved, then who or what was in that house now? Was it possible Richard Harmon had returned after all these years, slipping quietly back into his old life? Was it possible he had never actually left, hiding somewhere all this time, closer than anyone imagined? That night I decided I needed real answers, not more speculation, not more second-hand stories from neighbors who only knew fragments. I couldn't keep guessing at something this significant, something clearly still affecting real people's lives decades later. At exactly 9 o'clock, when the lights came on again, right on their unwavering schedule, I walked over, but this time I didn't knock. Instead, I quietly walked around to the side of the house, toward a window I could see into without being seen myself, moving carefully through the narrow gap between the fence and the wall. What I saw stopped me completely, freezing me in place with one hand still resting on the rough wood of the fence. Sitting at the kitchen table, in the exact seat Mrs. Watfold used to sit in every time I had glimpsed her through that same window over the years, was a young woman I had never seen before. She was maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, wearing a plain grey sweater that looked slightly too big for her, like it belonged to someone else. She sat perfectly still, staring at the empty seat across from her, the second plate still set, still waiting for someone who clearly wasn't coming, at least not tonight. I watched her for almost a full minute, unable to move, unable to look away. My breath held so tightly in my chest that it began to ache. Then, slowly, almost as if she sensed my presence even through the glass and the darkness outside, she turned her head and looked directly at the window where I was standing. I ducked down immediately, my heart slamming against my chest so hard I was sure she must have heard it, and hurried back to my own house as fast as I could without making noise, my footsteps careful even in my panic, my mind racing through every possible explanation and finding none of them satisfying. I didn't sleep at all that night, lying awake and staring at my ceiling, replaying the image of her face turning toward the window again and again. There was something else that happened before I went to Frank a second time, something I hadn't planned on and didn't fully understand until much later. 2 days after seeing Sarah through the window, on an ordinary grey afternoon, I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, a few houses down, in a spot where nobody usually parked. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except that it stayed there for hours, well past the time any visitor would normally linger, and the man inside never got out. He simply sat there, occasionally glancing toward Mrs. Watfold's house, then checking his phone, then looking again. I told myself it was nothing, maybe someone waiting for a delivery or a contractor scoping out work for a neighbor. But the next evening, right around 8:45, 15 minutes before the lights would come on next door, the same car appeared again, parked in almost the same spot. This time, I watched more carefully from behind my own curtains, my earlier fear returning in a different, sharper form. The man inside was in his 40s, wearing a plain jacket, nothing that stood out, nothing that should have made me nervous. But there was something deliberate in the way he watched the house, something practiced and patient, like a person who had done this kind of watching before. At exactly 9, when the lights came on next door as they always did, I saw him sit up slightly straighter, lean forward, and take a photograph with his phone through the windshield. My stomach tightened. Whoever this was, he wasn't a curious neighbor or a lost driver. He was watching that house on purpose, documenting it, the same way I had been, except his reasons clearly weren't as innocent as mine. I didn't approach him. I didn't call out or try to get his license plate, though I thought about it. Instead, I stayed at my window until he finally started the car and drove away sometime after 10, Tulut's disappearing around the corner. I didn't sleep much that night either, turning the image of him over and over in my mind, wondering if my harmless curiosity had somehow put me in the middle of something far more serious than I understood. I saw the same car twice more over the following week, always around the same time, always parked at a careful distance. I never mentioned it to Sarah directly, not wanting to alarm her before I understood what was happening, but I started paying closer attention to my own street in a way I never had before, noticing which cars belonged and which didn't, which faces were familiar and which weren't. It was only much later, after everything came out into the open, that I learned how right I had been to feel uneasy. The man in the sedan, according to what Sarah eventually told the authorities, had indeed been connected to Gerd Vuss, hired quietly to monitor the house and report back on any unusual activity, part of the same threat that had driven Alana into hiding in the first place. Knowing that now, knowing how close real danger had actually come to that quiet street, still makes my chest tighten a little when I think about those weeks. The next morning, exhausted but resolved, I decided I had to know who this woman was. I couldn't keep living next to a mystery like this indefinitely, wondering every night what was happening behind those glowing windows, jumping at every small sound from next door. I went back to Frank's porch, hoping he might have more answers, and described what I had seen the night before, leaving out the part where I had essentially been spying through someone's window. His face went pale as I spoke, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his mouth. "That sounds like Alana's daughter," he said quietly, setting the cup down without drinking. "Sarah, she would have been just a little girl when her father disappeared, maybe 6 or 7 years old at the time. I heard she moved away years ago, after some kind of falling out with her mother, something that was never really explained to anyone on this street. Nobody around here has seen her in probably 15 years, not since she was a teenager, really." "Why would she come back now?" I asked. "And why is she sitting in that house every night, like she's waiting for someone who never arrives?" Frank shook his head slowly, genuine confusion and concern crossing his weathered features. "I don't know, son, but if I were you, I'd be careful. Whatever's going on in that house, it's not really your business, and old secrets like that one, they don't always stay buried peacefully once someone starts digging them up." He was right, of course, in the practical sense. It wasn't my business. It had nothing to do with me directly. But by that point, having invested so many sleepless nights and so much nervous energy into this mystery, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to understand, from needing some kind of resolution to everything I had witnessed. I decided to try one more thing before giving up entirely, before convincing myself to simply let the whole strange situation go and return to my ordinary, quiet life. I wrote a short note, simple and direct, careful not to sound threatening or accusatory, and left it in Mrs. Watfold's mailbox on my way to work one morning. "I don't mean to intrude. I'm your neighbor, Daniel. If you need anything, or if something is wrong, please let me know. I just want to make sure everyone is safe." I signed it with my name and my phone number, then walked away before I could second-guess myself and take it back. I didn't expect a response, honestly. I assumed the note would simply sit in that mailbox indefinitely, unread and unanswered, another small mystery added to the pile. But 2 days later, coming home from a long day at work, I found a note pushed halfway under my own front door, waiting for me on the entryway mat. It was written in careful, slightly shaky handwriting, the kind that suggested someone writing under real emotional strain. Please stop watching the house. It's not what you think. My mother is not missing. She asked me to come back and finish something she started years ago. I will explain when it's over. Please, just give us until the end of the month. I read the note 3 times, standing in my own doorway, trying to understand what it meant, turning the words over in my mind. Finish something she started years ago. What could that possibly mean? What kind of unfinished business could require lights turning on every night at exactly 9, a dinner table set for 2, a young woman sitting alone in an empty house? I decided to respect the request, at least for a little while, though every instinct told me to keep watching, to keep asking questions. I stopped walking over to the fence at night. I stopped watching the windows so closely, forcing myself to look away when 9 o'clock arrived, to focus on my own dinner, my own television shows, my own ordinary evening routine. But I still noticed the lights, every night, exactly at 9, glowing faintly at the edge of my vision, even when I tried not to look directly at them. 2 weeks passed this way, slower than any 2 weeks I could remember, filled with a strange, quiet tension that culminated every evening. I mentioned to Priya, during another lunch break, that I had decided to stop worrying about my neighbor entirely, and she seemed relieved, telling me it was probably healthier not to spend my evenings watching someone else's windows. I let her believe that was the whole truth. It was easier than trying to explain a mystery I barely understood myself, and safer, I realized later, for everyone involved if fewer people knew what was actually happening next door. Then, one evening in early November, everything changed, all at once, in a way I hadn't expected despite weeks of waiting for exactly this kind of resolution. I was sitting in my living room, half watching a movie I wasn't really paying attention to, when I heard a knock at my own front door. I opened it, and standing there, illuminated by my porch light, was Sarah, the young woman I had seen through the window that night weeks earlier. Up close, she looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept properly in weeks, maybe longer. But there was something calm in her eyes too, something settled, like a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders after a very long time carrying it. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, her voice steady despite the visible exhaustion. I invited her inside without hesitation, and we sat down at my kitchen table, the same kind of table, I realized with a strange pang, as the one I had seen set for 2 through her mother's window. "I owe you an explanation," she said, folding her hands in front of her, "and an apology for scaring you these past few weeks. I know how strange all of this must have looked from the outside." "I'd really like to understand what's been happening," I said honestly. "I've thought about almost nothing else." She took a deep breath, glancing down at her hands for a moment before looking back up at me, and then she told me the whole story, speaking slowly at first, then faster as the details poured out, like she had been holding all of it inside for far too long and finally had somewhere safe to put it. Her father, Richard Harmon, had indeed disappeared over 20 years ago, accused of financial fraud, just as the old newspaper article had described. But according to Sarah, the truth was far more complicated than anything the newspapers had reported at the time, more complicated than even her mother had understood for years afterward. Richard hadn't stolen the money for himself, hadn't run off to enjoy some secret fortune in another country. He had been forced into the scheme by his business partner, a man named Gerald Voss, who had threatened his family, threatened Elaine and young Sarah specifically. If Richard didn't cooperate with the fraudulent scheme, Voss had been running for years under the cover of their legitimate financial advisory business. When the investigation began closing in, when auditors started asking uncomfortable questions and regulators began circling, Richard had panicked, believing that if he simply disappeared, took the blame silently by vanishing, he could protect his wife and daughter from Voss's very real threats, from a man who had already shown he was willing to hurt people to protect his own interests. It had seemed, in that desperate moment, like the only option available to him, even though it meant abandoning everything and everyone he loved. He had contacted Elaine secretly over the years that followed, Sarah explained, always briefly, always from different locations, using different phones, never revealing exactly where he was staying or what name he was using. He had been trying, quietly and carefully, for 2 entire decades, to gather evidence against his old business partner, hoping one day to clear his name completely and come home safely to the family he had been forced to leave behind. It had taken him that long, moving carefully, working odd jobs under assumed names, slowly building relationships with people who could help him, slowly collecting documents and testimonies that Voss had spent decades trying to make sure never existed. 6 weeks before I first noticed the empty house next door, Elaine had received a message from Richard, delivered through one of his careful, indirect channels. He had finally gathered enough evidence, finally reached the point where he believed he could clear his name completely. He was ready to come home and turn himself in, along with the proof that would clear him and expose Gerald Voss as the actual architect of the fraud that had destroyed so many lives, including their own. But before he could return, before any of this careful plan could unfold safely, Elaine received a different message, one that terrified her in a way the original disappearance never had. This one wasn't from Richard. It was a warning, delivered anonymously but unmistakably connected to their old life. Someone connected to Gerald Voss, still active in certain circles even after all these years, had somehow discovered that Richard was planning to come forward, and they threatened Elaine directly, telling her that if Richard went to the authorities with his evidence, her safety and her daughter's safety would be in serious danger. Terrified and unsure who else she could trust with something this dangerous, Elaine had contacted Sarah, whom she hadn't spoken to properly in years after a painful falling out that had followed Richard's original disappearance, a rift caused by grief and confusion and misplaced blame that neither of them had ever fully worked through. Despite everything unresolved between them, Elaine asked Sarah to help her disappear quietly and safely, to protect herself while she worked with Richard, through his careful indirect contacts, to finally take down the man responsible for destroying their family in the first place. The house being seemingly abandoned, the strange lights turning on every night, the dinner table set for 2, all of it had been part of a careful, deliberate plan, more elaborate than I could have imagined from my side of the fence. Elaine had actually been staying somewhere else entirely, in a secure location arranged with help from people Richard had come to trust, working with a lawyer and eventually federal investigators to build an airtight case against her husband's former business partner. Sarah had been coming to the empty house each night at exactly the same time to maintain the appearance that someone was still living there normally, hoping to avoid suspicion from anyone who might be watching the house on Voss's behalf, while secretly relaying messages between her parents and the authorities, now helping them build their case. The dinner table, set every single night without fail, wasn't for a ghost or stranger or anything supernatural at all. It was a strange, quietly heartbreaking ritual Sarah had started entirely on her own, sitting alone in her mother's kitchen each evening, missing the family she had lost so many years earlier, waiting, in some small symbolic way, for the day they might finally all be reunited around that same table again. My mother didn't disappear because something happened to her, Sarah told me, her voice breaking slightly on the words. She disappeared to protect all of us, one more time, the same way my father did all those years ago. And in 3 days, my father is finally coming home. For the first time in over 20 years, since before I even really remember him clearly. I sat there, stunned into silence, trying to process everything she had just told me, all of it settling slowly into place like pieces of a puzzle I had been assembling blindly for weeks. The empty house, the lights at 9 o'clock, the shadow in the window that first frightened night. All of it suddenly made a strange, heartbreaking kind of sense that no supernatural explanation ever could have provided. "Why 9 o'clock exactly?" I asked, still curious about that one small, specific detail that had haunted so many of my evenings. Sarah smiled sadly, the expression complicated with years of grief and hope tangled together. "That was always dinner time, growing up, before everything happened. My father was strict about it, actually, always wanted the whole family together at exactly 9, no matter how busy his work got. I guess some habits just don't go away, even after 20 years, even after everything that's happened since." I told her then about the dark sedan, about the man who had photographed the house through his windshield on at least 3 separate evenings. Her face went pale as I described him, and she asked me careful, specific questions about what he looked like, what kind of car it was, whether I had noticed the direction he drove away in. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, her hands pressed flat against the table. "That matches someone my mother's lawyer already suspected," she said finally. "There's a private investigator connected to Voss's old associates, someone he's used before to intimidate witnesses. We didn't know for certain he'd found this address yet. This is actually important. I need to call someone tonight." She pulled out her phone immediately, apologizing, and stepped into my hallway to make a brief, urgent call to a number she clearly knew by heart. When she came back, she looked shaken but grateful. "They're moving up the timeline," she said. "If he's already watching the house, it isn't safe to wait as long as we planned. My father may need to come in sooner than 3 days." That piece of information changed the tone of everything that followed. What I had assumed was a slow, carefully managed plan suddenly felt much more urgent, much more fragile, and I found myself genuinely afraid for people I had known, until recently, only as a quiet older woman and her equally quiet, mysterious daughter. We talked for almost 2 more hours that night. Long after the movie I had been watching ended, and the house grew quiet around us. She told me more about her childhood before the disappearance, about vague, fragmented memories of her father, about the difficult years afterward when she and her mother had struggled separately with grief and suspicion, and the whispered judgments of people who assumed the worst about a man who had vanished with other people's money. She told me about her own anger toward her mother in her teenage years, misplaced blame that had driven them apart for so long, and about the slow, cautious process of rebuilding trust that had begun only weeks earlier when Elaine reached out asking for help. 2 nights after that conversation, unable to sleep, I noticed the dark sedan parked outside one final time, sitting in its usual spot with its usual patient stillness. But this time, before 9 o'clock even arrived, a second car pulled up quietly behind it, unmarked but clearly official, and 2 people in plain clothes stepped out and approached the sedan on foot. I watched, barely breathing, as a brief conversation took place through the driver's side window, followed by the man being asked to step out of his vehicle. I never learned exactly what was said, but the sedan didn't return after that night, and I later understood that federal investigators, alerted by Sarah's urgent call, had moved quickly to identify and question the man once they realized surveillance on the house had already begun. It was one of the few moments in this entire story where I felt, watching from my window, that I had actually been some small, useful part of protecting the people next door, rather than simply an anxious observer caught up in something too big for me to understand. With that immediate danger addressed, the timeline Sarah had mentioned shifted again, this time back toward the original plan, though everyone involved remained more cautious than before. Sarah came by twice more in the days that followed, each time a little less exhausted, a little more like someone finally allowed to exhale after holding her breath for months. She told me more about the lawyer working with her parents, a careful, methodical woman who had spent nearly a year quietly building the legal framework that would let Richard return safely, and about the federal investigators who had grown increasingly interested in Gerald Voss as more evidence accumulated. She admitted one evening that she had been afraid to trust me at first, afraid that a curious neighbor asking questions might accidentally expose everything before they were ready, and that watching me from the kitchen window that first night had genuinely frightened her as much as seeing her had frightened me. "I almost didn't come to your door that night," she told me. "I stood outside for almost 10 minutes trying to decide if it was safe to trust you, but you left that first note, the kind one, and it made a difference. It reminded me that not everyone watching a house from the outside means harm." 3 days later, exactly as Sarah had promised, a car pulled into the driveway next door in the early evening, well before the usual 9 o'clock schedule that had governed those strange weeks. An older man stepped out slowly, gray-haired, moving carefully, looking at the house like he wasn't quite sure it was real, like 20 years of hiding had made him forget how to simply walk up to his own front door without fear. Elaine came out to meet him on the porch, moving faster than I had ever seen her move in the years I had known her as a quiet, careful neighbor, and even from a distance, across the yard, through the deepening evening light, I could see them embrace tightly, holding onto each other like two people who had spent 20 years afraid they would never get this exact moment, this exact reunion. I watched from my own window, not wanting to intrude on something so private and so long awaited, but unable to look away entirely from a moment that felt, somehow, like the true ending to a story I had accidentally become part of. A week later, the story broke properly in the local news, filling in details I hadn't known even from Sarah's account. Richard Harmon had turned himself involuntarily to federal authorities, providing extensive, detailed evidence against his former business partner, Gerald Voss, evidence he had spent 2 decades carefully gathering from a distance. Voss was arrested shortly afterward and charged with multiple counts of fraud spanning over 2 decades, along with charges related to the threats made against Elaine more recently. Because of the substantial evidence Richard had provided, and the clear, well-documented proof that he had been coerced into the original scheme rather than willingly complicit in defrauding his own clients, prosecutors agreed to significantly reduce the charges against him, acknowledging the unusual and genuinely coercive circumstances of his case. Elaine Harmon, once known on our streets simply as the quiet widow Mrs. Whitfield, finally had her real name back, restored publicly and legally, and finally had her husband home after 2 decades of uncertainty, grief, and careful, hidden hope. A few months later, well into the following spring, I saw Sarah in the yard again, this time in bright daylight, laughing genuinely with her mother as they planted new flowers along the front walkway of the house that had once seemed so abandoned and mysterious to me. Richard was there too, kneeling in the dirt beside them, his grey hair catching the sunlight, looking entirely unremarkable, entirely ordinary, exactly like any other retired man enjoying a Saturday in his garden. Sarah caught my eye across the yard and waved, a genuine, easy smile crossing her face, and for the first time since all of this began, watching them together, it felt like an ordinary, peaceful afternoon on an ordinary, peaceful street. I never expected that an empty house and a strange, repeating pattern of lights would lead me into someone else's decades-old secret, into a story of fear and sacrifice and quiet, stubborn hope that had unfolded almost entirely out of sight of everyone around it. But it taught me something I still think about today, something I've carried with me long after the lights next door returned to their normal, unremarkable schedule. Sometimes the things that frighten us the most, the shadows we don't understand, the mysteries hidden behind closed curtains and empty-looking houses, aren't threats at all. Sometimes they're simply people doing whatever it takes, in whatever quiet and desperate way they can manage, to protect the people they love most in the world, even when that protection looks, from the outside, like fear, like secrecy, like something to be afraid of. I learned to be a little slower to assume the worst about the things I don't understand, and a little more willing to ask, gently and without judgment, whether someone might actually need help rather than suspicion. I learned that the stories we tell ourselves about our neighbors, about the quiet people living just beyond our fences, are almost always incomplete, missing entire decades of struggle and love and sacrifice that never make it into casual conversation over a shared property line. I also learned something about myself in those weeks, something I hadn't expected to discover from watching a neighbor's lights turn on and off. I learned that curiosity, when it comes from a place of genuine concern rather than idle nosiness, can matter more than we realize. If I had never knocked, never left that first careful note, never asked Frank his half-remembered stories about a man named Harmon, I might never have noticed that dark sedan parked across the street, and I might never have said anything that led Sarah to make that urgent call which, in the end, helped keep her family safe during the most dangerous final stretch of a 20-year ordeal. It's strange to think that something as small as watching a window a little too closely or writing a short, simple note could end up mattering in a story so much bigger than my own quiet life. Richard and Elaine still live in that house today. I see them most weekends now, working in the garden together or sitting on the porch in the evening the way people do when they've earned the right to simply be still and unhurried. Sarah visits often, sometimes staying for a week at a time, and the three of them have slowly built something that looks, from the outside at least, like an ordinary, happy family finally allowed to exist in the open after 2 decades hidden in fragments and fear. Gerald Voss was convicted a year later, sentenced to a long prison term, and the case even received some attention in the wider financial press as an example of how deeply a single fraudulent scheme can damage innocent lives for decades after the initial crime. Sometimes, in the evening, I still glance out my kitchen window out of old habit, half expecting to see those lights come on again at exactly 9 o'clock, the whole mysterious pattern repeating itself one more time. Instead, I usually see something far more ordinary now, a lit window with real people moving behind it, laughter sometimes drifting faintly across the yard, the simple, unremarkable glow of a family finally home together with nothing left to hide. Because sometimes, the strangest mystery on your street isn't dangerous at all. Sometimes, it's just love, hiding patiently in the dark, waiting for exactly the right moment to finally come home.